All right, here we are starting our Egypt unit. And we probably already know a lot about Egypt. It's common mythology. It's such a source of like Hollywood drama that it's hard not to know a little to a lot about Egypt and some of its practice and customs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about its formation, how so maybe there's some preconceived misconceptions about it as a society. And then there's a lot of films on there that I want you guys to check out. But what we do know about Egypt is that it actually there was an upper and lower Egypt at the very beginning. Lower actually being in the north and upper being in the south, which seems backwards, but that's what happens. And these two, they did trade and get along at times, but then they also warred like any other, civilization would. And what we know and what's so important about this work is we have another stela here, similar to what we saw in Mesopotamia. And here we have a similar scene, right, where we have a king conquering his foes. And we know this king because of this bowling pin sort of shaped hat. And this is showing when Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were at war, and Narmer, who's king at the time, uh, and is a part of the Upper Egypt, he's here killing his foe, right? Which sort of symbolically is killing off his enemies, and this is when Upper and Lower Egypt are united into one Egypt. We do see Horus, the god, and he's synonymous there with Upper Egypt, and and what we have on the back is the other king right here, and that's the other sort of headdress that we have for a king in Egypt. And so after this time, we see those two headdresses combined together, having little bowling pin sort of structure with that curved structure going on. And they're kings. Now, we sometimes think, oh, no, they're called pharaohs. Well, no, they actually didn't start using that term pharaoh until much later in the civilization. There's a early, middle, high period sort of thing, and then sort of the end as things start to go down. And that's actually in the toward the end is when we get the term pharaoh for the first time. So they're really kings, or known as kings, up until this point. This is originally, this palette or stela is actually originally used for a shade, like it would be connected to a staff, and so that would be held to sort of block the sun, and which I could imagine be pretty heavy, that being made out of slate. But so we have this functional item that also sort of tells a story in this depiction. And I'm going to move on to the next slide, because depictions in Egypt, we know, right, they're very sort of stereotypical to us. And similar to Mesopotamian, we do see an adjustment of scale. And what's very interesting about Egyptian art is that when it comes to the depiction of their gods or people and these hieroglyphs on the wall, everything is done in a grid format. Everything has a structure of units to it. And this is very synonymous with the culture, because their culture is all about order and structure. So for over 1,000 years, these images never, and the making of these images never changed, which is just just unfathomable in our culture that seems to change every week or month or so, with new sort of styles and trends. But everything was laid out in this grid, and so a god would be represented by so many cubits, a regular human so many cubits, and so on and so forth. And it was that standard throughout their entire time. What we do see here is one of the Book of the Dead. There are actually several sort of Book of the Deads and pages of it, because we know Egyptians were very much are known for their dead, right, and sort of how they monumentalize that. And what we see here is their form of writing called hieroglyphs, which is picture drawing, right, different than cuneiform, which was little marks and more synonymous with our writing style. This is actual pictures that are being used to sort of give us that written language. Being about dead, I'm sure a lot of you already know about mummification and the process of that. the stereotype of the brain being removed through the nostrils. What they would do is make an incision on the side of the dead king and remove the organs and place them in these jars, these copper jars, and those were, everything was sort of preserved for the afterlife. The body was used with salt and oils and stuff because the body needed to be sort of that spiritual vehicle for the dead, to then use in the afterlife. And they were, of course, buried in their tombs, several different types of tombs, for everything from caves to pyramids to other temple structures that they built over time. And in there, they would bury their items, the precious items, because they believed that when the soul came back and the soul was there living, like, they needed all this stuff in the afterlife, so it was buried with them. Some of those architectural forms about the death are the obelisk and, of course, the pyramid. And I want you to watch the Giza, the Lost City of Pyramid Builders on Canopy. It's a nice film, a little over exaggerated, the guy on it, but he's harmless. And anyway, you'll get a really good sense of how these things were built and all of sort of the celestial components that go with it. But the obelisk too is very interesting because this is copied by many cultures. I mean, we think of it as our Washington Monument, right, as an obelisk, but these had sort of spiritual powers and were sort of like gateways between earth and sky, both the pyramid and the obelisk, that way for the body and soul and the gods also to transcend. But so they had this connection between the earth and the gods and were very important within the culture. Now, the most famous probably of the dead pharaohs is the young boy, King Tutankhamun. And then there's another video there. It's a 25-minute or so documentary on PBS that's put out and shows the original excavation and shows what they've done and also how poor archaeology can be. King Tut has a huge sort of mythology about him because most of those who excavated his tomb, they said it was, of course, cursed because the seal had never been broken. All those people ended up dying very interesting and horrific deaths. And so if you're interested more about that, you can check it out. They're well documented how some of the people met their demise after opening the tomb of King Tutankhamun. But what's important about it is we have a tomb that was untouched and shows the idea of the wealth that even a young king who was only 18 or so when he died would have had. And many other tombs, of course, were looted usually within even weeks after the burial. You can imagine, that's kind of somebody's occupation, but here we have a preserved site. And so of course, the Mask of Tutankhamun has been very popular. Now, moving a little bit north and into what was going to be known as Greece, we're going to talk a little bit about the Aegean. It starts in sort of three movements and three areas, right, called the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean. And these people were the early Greeks, the Greeks before the Greeks, as I say there. And we're going to kind of look at how each was very specific and then, of course, sort of fade away. And then, of course, the Greeks occupy and sort of claim some of that mythology. On your Moodle shell, there's a short intro to Greece video that I want you to watch. It'll really help sort of tie more of this together and give you a greater picture than what's going on. But for the Minoan society, we know more about these people because they were on the largest of the islands called Crete, and because they're sort of the tales and the mythology that lasted from them, like the Minotaur and some of those early Greek myths come from this area. And really, Minoan civilization was pretty much gone and abandoned by the time that what we know as the Greeks arrived. And so they kind of claimed conquering them without having to, because they didn't really ever have to fight or anything like that. But Um, what we see here, one of the earliest works, is a fresco, and just the dark parts are really what survived. This is a kind of a reconstruction that's going on, but these areas here are the true part of the fresco that are left. But what we're seeing here is this very interesting scene that's pretty unclear about what is going on. We do see three individuals, with this bull. We do know that the lighter the skin of the individual, that would represent the female gender, and the darker skin male. So we look at this, we have two females with one male. So we're thinking that, maybe it's a society that didn't really have a hierarchy on gender, because it looks like all three are partaking in this activity in some regard. We also see what looks like one character in the very front with the horns underneath their arm, one in the middle doing some sort of acrobat, and one in the end either landing or cheering the other one on. So it could be seen as sort of like, here are the stages, kind of like how a comic or flip book would work. But this whole scene is very odd. The bull itself, actually, there is an ancient species of bull that's now extinct that was very large, that they believe that is what's being depicted here. But this has been, some archaeologists and scholars actually tried to reproduce this act, and people were killed trying. This idea of getting your body right in between the bull's horns and then having it flip you over its head and do this. It's been said that it is impossible. So what's being depicted here just seems to be maybe more a fantasy than actually what's going on, but just lots and lots of speculation about it. But we do see the figures are highly stylized. We still don't have them in the front position or on the side, like what we've seen both with Mesopotamia and Egypt. And they're just kind of this awkward thing, right? But pretty interesting. As we move on, we begin to see some of the earliest forms of sculpture. So these are actually Greek. I know we're sort of like fast forwarding the culture, but Greeks themselves, of course, are trading or dealing and have contact with the Egyptians. So the first image that I have here looks very much Egyptian, right? We have this figure that's sort of standing and moving towards us, but the arms are still by its side. It's trying to sort of step out of that stone, but needs that support in it on its feet there, and it's not anatomically correct. It's still highly stylized. But what we see in really a short amount of time, then on your right is which was actually found by a diver in the Mediterranean Sea, and it's one of two pieces, is an actual bronze from Greek times. A lot of the bronzes from Greek were taken and melted down for weapons, and of course taken, stolen, things like that over time as they lose their civilization and Rome survives. So we have very, very, very few bronzes left, and this diver happened to find two of them. And what we see here is what seems to be a perfect male body, the perfect sort of warrior. Under more review, we realize that it still is a little stylized. There's a few extra vertebrae that are added in the back just to sort of give this elongation of the torso, and of course the hyper stylized of the muscles and stuff. But who wouldn't want hyper stylized muscles? That'd be great. But what we see here is that the Greeks knew what they were doing, and not only using bronze but crafting the human form. So pretty interesting. One really amazing work also is Venus de Milo. This is a pretty famous one, and it's where we see for the first time a god sort of stripped bare and sexualized. And then we also see Laocoon, another marble, which is beauty, and you should check out that YouTube link there. It's got some great story and how it influences Michelangelo later in life when he gets it unearthed in Italy and he rides to see it and wants to be the first to see it. So check those out. And there's our end of Greece.